Hey everyone, in this video I actually want to talk about the line between Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. I had the opportunity to speak at the Azure Live event yesterday where I did a PowerPoint version of this talk, and then I thought it would be fun to kind of just do a whiteboard version, and some people have asked about, hey, what about a whiteboard? Maybe people missed the event. So my goal today is to really talk about what's the difference between AD and Azure AD. And is Azure AD just AD in Azure, or is it something completely different? And spoiler, it's something completely different. So I'm going to go through what those differences are and how they really work together. As always, if it is useful, a like, subscribe, comment, and share is appreciated. And make sure you hit that bell so you get notifications when I release new videos. So let's kind of start from the beginning. I kind of think about Active Directory. So Active Directory was introduced with Windows 2000. So it's now 21 years old. You can go and buy a drink in America. And it really introduced this concept of a true directory service. So we had this Active Directory domain services, and it was built on X.500. So we had this kind of structured approach actually to it. I could interact with LDAP, and it spoke protocols that at that time enabled this new way of working. We had, for example, things like Kerberos, and we still had things like NTLM, and we could interact with the directory using things like LDAP. Now, for this to function, the way this really worked is we had a machine, a server, whatever that might be, and essentially what would happen is that machine would join the domain. And what that meant by joining the domain is there was now a computer record in the Active Directory for that machine, and they shared a secret. Now that secret was important to support things like Kerberos. It enabled the domain controllers that really personified the Active Directory service to create tokens they could give to kind of a client that they couldn't really understand, but they could present to the server, and the server would know, oh, okay, this came from the Active Directory. Now, all of this you could kind of think about was on an intranet. These were all on kind of this safe, secure island of networking. And so I had lots of ports. I could really talk about anything I wanted. So there were kind of lots of ports open. I wasn't really restricted. It used DNS to actually go and find the things. And then there was no really limitation to how I could actually talk. So if we actually quickly jumped over and looked at an old kind of Active Directory, I say old, I'm obviously still using this. But here, this is kind of my AD, and you can see we have a structure. So if I look, for example, over here at, you can say the Justice League, you can see that's an organizational unit which has child organizational units. Now, these are super powerful because I can do things like delegation. I could give someone certain permissions just on the objects in there. I could apply group policy configurations at those levels. And I could use it just for kind of general organization. So we had this very powerful set of capabilities, and of course it had the idea of locations. I could define sites in Active Directory that were based around IP subnets, and then how they were connected to really optimize the whole experience. But the key part was we had these computer records in the Active Directory that represented the various objects that had joined the AD, and they were the cornerstone of using a lot of the kind of security, the authentications that we leveraged. So this was all super important to the way Active Directory actually worked. And this was fine because everything AD was doing was on our secure little intranet. Yes, there was the internet over here, but really, when this started out, the internet sure was email. So I'd have like an MX record, I would get things. There was news groups, but really I'm just looking at cartoons. The internet was nothing serious on that internet. We really just didn't care about it. So we were very happy in our little island where I joined the domain. And I said servers, this could be desktops as well. And we had these protocols so I could interact in using this central identity structure. My account I had kind of an account in my AD that I could then use because everything trusted this kind of in-house identity provider. So all was well in the world. Well, then things kind of started to shift a little bit. The internet started to do more than just have news groups and cartoons. So now we had the idea that, okay, out here, over the internet, we had some kind of cloud application that I as a company wanted to use. Now I was very limited about how I could do that. And what initially happened is, for the users that wanted to use those cloud applications, well, they'd have to create a separate account out there. And that was really bad for everyone. Now remember, this is over the internet. So over the internet, I'm not opening up a broad range of services. I'm really talking 443. I have that encrypted HTTPS, TLS. So a lot of these things wouldn't work anyway because they use different ports. There's a whole set of things. So I'm accessing these web-based services. I'd have to create a separate account. And if it was just one service, it's kind of a pain. But as this grew more and more popular, it's an issue. It's bad for me as the user because now if I'm using 10 cloud apps, I have 10 different credentials. I'm never going to remember that. So I don't do 10 different credentials. I do one, and I use the same password and username 10 times. Well, if one of those is compromised, I've now compromised everything, including probably my corporate credentials. I use the same password. So that's bad for me trying to remember 10. It's bad for my company because now I'm exposed. If my users are using the same credential, that's bad for me. And if the user leaves my company, I can disable this account. But if I have 10 separate accounts, how do I quickly get rid of those? I can't, to stop them having access. And it's bad for the cloud app because they're now having to maintain those identities and have services to allow them, for example, to reset passwords when they ultimately forget them. So it was bad for everyone. No one kind of liked this scheme. And so the goal was, okay, I don't want this. I do not want a separate identity at the cloud apps. I want to be able to use my home identity, my home realm, with those. And so what was born was the idea of federation. So now I could have kind of a service running on-prem, and this was some kind of federation service. This could be ADFS, it could be something else. Now the whole point of this federation, it was kind of tied into my local identity provider. And now what happens is when me as a user wants to actually access that cloud app, well, that federation has been established between the cloud app and my federation service. That's all out of band, i.e. they don't have a live connection. Out of band, I've established all of the various configurations around that federation. So that is, for example, what certificate they're going to use that would be trusted, what claims and the format that's going to be in these token things they're going to use. So I have to maintain that. But when that's established, now what happens is I as the user basically say, hey, I want to use this service. It says, I don't know who you are. I need a token. It might do a home realm discovery and kind of bounce my web browser back. I would now go and talk to my federation service, say, hey, I'm trying to talk to this thing. I need a token. It would do an authentication to me. Now it would probably use Kerberos. I'm already sitting on my local network, so I already have a token that I can use to authenticate to that. So it's completely seamless to me. I just kind of see my web browser bouncing around. It would then generate this nice little token for me. This is a SAML token, so this is kind of using SAML. It would give me that token, and then I would redirect back again to the service, passing it my token, and I'm authenticated. It would be able to trust it because it's been signed by that certificate they agreed to out of band, and I've got claims in it about me that it would use to actually say, okay, so what can they really do? So this kind of solved the challenge of now I don't have a separate identity. I'm using my home realm identity. It's good for me as the user. I have one account. It's good for my company because I have one account. I'm not creating passwords all over the place. And if I disable their account, that's the same account being used everywhere. And these people no longer have to worry about maintaining a list of identities. Now, there were some pain points with this. Obviously, we have to maintain the idea of these certificates. We have to rotate them periodically. I have to maintain what are we putting in the claims. I have to go and do that configuration. And also this federation thing I drew here as this box, there's a bunch of stuff to that. I can think about, well, it has to be public facing for one thing. So it's facing the internet on kind of that 443. I then have a bunch of kind of proxies at the front end to receive the initial kind of requests coming in. And then I'll actually kind of have the federation farm behind it to actually create the token. So there's an amount of work I have to do to secure that and maintain it. So it's all kind of work, but it does the job. It gets me there. It gets me out of the business of now my users have this whole bunch of different tokens. There's a fair amount of work to that thing. And if we think about more and more use of cloud applications, this starts to become a challenge. This idea of maintaining all of these, securing that, making it highly available, and also thinking about, well, my users, they're less and less now on my network. Do I want them to have to VPN in? It becomes painful and a bit more in their face and a bit more work. Also, we start to see this shift. So this idea of this authentication starts to change more to the idea about consent. And you've probably seen this, for example, if I'm using an application and I'm trying to kind of use my Facebook credential, the app asks, hey, can I access your pictures or your contacts? And you say yes. So that's you consenting that that application, that client app, is allowed now to go and get a token acting as on your behalf. You are the resource owner of a set of resources on a resource server, for example, Facebook, and I'm now saying, hey, this client app is out to work on my behalf within the scope you're saying yes to. And that's now becoming far more common as a way to actually do that authorization of something working on my behalf. So that whole shift to modern authentication, that OAuth 2, that OpenID Connect you're going to hear more and more about, I can't do that with those things. So we have this new set of challenges that we really want to do. So how do we solve this? So as you would expect, kind of enter Azure Active Directory. So now we introduce this concept of Azure AD. And I'm just going to say right from the bat, Azure AD is not AD in Azure. The name would make you think that. It is not at all. There are no domain controllers sitting up here. It is a cloud-based identity provider. It speaks cloud, and that's kind of the key thing. So when I think about speaking cloud, well, sure, it speaks things like SAML. It speaks things like WS-Fed. But more useful in a lot of ways, it speaks things like OAuth 2. It speaks OpenID Connect. So OAuth 2 is more about authorization, that, hey, you can do this on my behalf. OpenID Connect is more about that kind of authentication. It's showing who I am, and it's actually built on OAuth 2. But this is actually what Azure AD is designed to speak. It also speaks things like SCIM. So SCIM, S-C-I-M, is this system for cross-domain identity management. And I can think about, hey, I'm accessing some cloud app. And maybe, yes, it can use my identity, but it still has some objects. Maybe it's kind of some kind of user object. Maybe it's some kind of group that I have to add things to. So SCIM is an open standard that has these /users/groups endpoints that I can now, on that other cloud app, go and do various types of actions on it. It's REST, it's standard verbs that I'm actually using, create, update, delete. So I can now automate, maybe I need to do some provisioning on that side. So it's going to actually let me do that. So Azure AD speaks those things. Now what's important to note here is Azure AD does not speak Kerberos. It does not speak NTLM. it does not speak LDAP. It is not those things. That's what AD speaks. Azure AD does not speak that. And that's really kind of a key important thing to realize. Now, if I think about, hey, so I'm going to write an application. When I'm writing my application, I'm using these kind of modern protocols and everything else. There's this kind of Microsoft Authentication Library, MSAL. It actually replaces the Azure AD Authentication Library, ADAL. And if I think about this modern authentication, you'll hear about tokens. You'll hear about an access token, which is a very short-lived token, 60 minutes by default, to go and access a particular resource, and then refresh tokens. This long-lived, rolling 90-day window. Sounds like a lot of work. So with things like MSAL, it does all the work for me. My app can make one call and it takes care of, hey, is my access token still good? Do I need to go and get a new token? It does everything for me. So that MSAL does all of the work around kind of that authentication, does all the work around kind of the tokens that I want to do. So you have this standard way of actually interacting with Azure AD. I can use things like the Microsoft Graph to go and do interactions like management and finding out information. But if I think about maybe the biggest thing of Azure AD, remember I talked about I have to create this federation. I have to kind of agree these certificates, what the claims is. I have to create those things. And in a modern company, I might be using 30, 40, a huge range of different cloud applications out there. So one of the things that Azure AD actually has is Azure AD has this huge kind of library built in of these federations, just out of the box. I can say, hey, I need a federation to X, and it's probably there already. There's a huge number of built-in federations, kind of just in box. I can actually add custom ones as well. So if maybe there isn't one for what I need, I can actually go and say, well, I want to add one based on SAML or password kind of credential stuffing, or just add it to my apps. I can write my own applications here. So I can actually add my own organizational apps very easily. I can even have applications that are on premises that I want to publish up through Azure AD and pre-authenticate with Azure AD using things like Azure AD App Proxy. So it has this phenomenal set of capabilities. So if we just quickly kind of jump over. So let's look at my Azure AD. And I can see this enterprise applications. Now I have some I've already pre-configured over here, but I can say, hey, add a new application. And there are literally thousands built in now. Now we can see there's cloud platforms. So AWS and Google Cloud and Oracle and SAP can just integrate with Azure AD. They are featured. Now I want you to notice these icons. It has these little icons to say, well, is it federated SSO? So things like SAML, OAuth 2 OpenID Connect. Does it support provisioning, i.e. SCIM, so we can actually go and create the objects on the other side. And we can see those little icons here on what elements it actually supports. So for example, I could say, okay, well, let's look at Dropbox. So for Dropbox, we can see, okay, this is using SAML-based sign-on, or it can do password-based, and it does support automatic provisioning. So it has kind of that SCIM support. If I was to go and look at something like maybe Exchange Online, well, we can see it's actually using OpenID Connect-based sign-on. It's one of those newer protocols. And it's not doing automatic provisioning, but that's because that object is just natively in Azure AD. It's using Azure AD as its identity provider, so there isn't additional provisioning actually required. But then there's just a whole bunch. I mean, there's literally thousands in this thing. Even if it doesn't normally support something like a federation, so Twitter doesn't support anything, but it can still kind of cache passwords. So it does credential stuffing. So what that would mean is there maybe I have a corporate Twitter account. I, as the administrator, can actually say, hey, I'm going to create this Twitter app and I'm going to put in the corporate password and username for Twitter. Then I can assign it to users. They don't ever know that password. If they leave, they lose it. Or I could say, hey, on first use, let the user enter their own credential, and it will kind of automatically populate it in the future. So different ways of leveraging that. I can add my own applications. So if it's not in the gallery of thousands, and pretty much kind of every app is in there, I can create my own. I could, hey, I'm actually going to create my own application I'm developing. I might say, hey, I want to publish an on-prem app using that app proxy, and it can kind of do pre-authentication. Or, hey, it's another app you don't have in there, but I need to kind of create there. And I could say, hey, I want to kind of create. And then it will give me the choice of, well, okay, so what sort of app is it? Is it just a link in the My Apps or the Office 365 app portal? Is it doing some kind of credential stuffing? Or is it maybe actually using SAML? And if it was SAML, I could then go in and actually specify, okay, well, these are the claims I want to populate. Here we go. Okay, well, here's the signing certificate. I can go and set up all of those things very, very simply. So I can still do my own custom ones if I actually need to. So we have all of that goodness just kind of built in. So when I think about, hey, Azure AD, it speaks cloud, and it has this massive number of federations just built in for me. So it makes my life so much simpler. But it does a lot more than that. I mean, this is probably one of the most attractive features, all these federations, that I can now just start using the cloud, and I can grant it to users based on group memberships. I can set different roles. But obviously, it does a lot more things than just that. One of the biggest things we see around Azure AD is kind of this idea of this kind of conditional access. And what conditional access does, it kind of adds this barrier, this protection around the Azure AD. So when I try and access something, it gets really tested against these conditional access policies. So I can essentially say, hey, I have a different set of assignment conditions when this policy should be used, and then what are the various controls I'm going to use around it. Now this integrates with things like Azure AD MFA, for example. So I might say, hey, this is a sensitive application, I'm detecting some heightened risk. I want you to do a stronger authentication if you haven't already. So if we jump over again and look at this, so here, if I actually go and jump over and I look at my security, firstly, there are things like other identity protection. There's a whole set of other capabilities it helps me with identity score, helping me be kind of what should I focus on. But under conditional access, I can create things like a terms of use, a PDF document that I can make them kind of agree to before they access maybe anything or maybe particular applications. I have kind of a very simple one over here, which is not something you would ever use in any real way. It's just a Homer Simpson version of me saying, behave. But I can link that to my various policies. I can define locations based on IP ranges, based on geographical countries, states, for example. Then I create these policies. And a policy is really nothing more than, when I say nothing more than, I can assign it based on all users, particular users, particular groups, based on particular roles if they are a guest user. I can then exclude users, directory roles, etc. I can target all apps. I can target a particular app. So here under my select, I can search for all the different apps that exist. Now these applications are ones that I have added to my Azure AD as an enterprise application. So remember, this could be any of those applications. It could be the ones that are in box that I've added to my Azure AD tenant. It might be a custom application that I've defined via SAML or credential stuffing. It could be one that I have developed that I'm linking against my Azure AD, or it could be something that I'm publishing using Azure AD App Proxy. All of those are going to show up. So here I can see all of the applications that I have. So to this point, if I search for SAV, I can see, hey, I've got some of my own apps I've developed. I'll also see ones from, let's see if I've got Office over here. I can see Office ones like Exchange and SharePoint. I would also be able to see custom ones. I could see things like Twitter. So I can assign policy to really anything I want. And I can even now do it to things like user actions. So if they're going to register security information, maybe they're registering MFA, that initial security information, I might have a policy that maybe says, hey, they have to be in a named location, like an on-premises. So I can increase some kind of security around that for that initial security information population. So I can target apps. And then I have this huge range of conditions. So it can integrate with things like Azure AD Identity Protection, a P2 feature that can establish user risk, session risk, based on machine learning. Is it some kind of anomalous behavior? They're from a location they don't normally work from. They're working at a time they don't normally work. Hey, we've detected malicious traffic from that same IP, or that IP is trying to authenticate against 10 different tenants. This huge range of different kind of checks across the entire spectrum of what sort of the Microsoft identity services cover. And then I could say, hey, I've detected this heightened risk for this sign-in. Maybe then I want an MFA. We don't want an MFA all the time, but hey, I've detected some risk. Let's make them MFA. I can target particular platforms. Obviously, if it's Windows Phone, we're probably going to reject that anyway. I could target locations, particular apps, device state. I have all these capabilities. Then I can control. Hey, I want to block access, or I want to grant access, but make them do an MFA. Make the device be marked as compliant according to things like Intune. It has to be hybrid joined, so it's in AD and Azure AD. An approved client app. I want them to change the password. I want them to accept one of my terms of use. It has to be one of them or all of them. I even have things like session controls. I can change that sign-in frequency. So instead of having that rolling 90-day window, I don't want that. I'm actually going to force them to basically whatever I configure here of this number of days, I'm going to change that. Or doesn't have to be days. I could do hours as well. I can fill in things like persistent browser session automatically instead of asking them, hey, do you want to do that? But essentially, it's this massive amount of controls at a per user, a per group, per app level. And that's so important because if I think about, hey, I've got this token, I still have maybe different degrees of what I need to access all of these applications. So conditional access is one of the biggest features of Azure AD. I think there is. This federation kind of broker built in is phenomenal, but then having this granularity of control about what I need to be met to access that, it is super, super important. Then there are other things. It has things like PIM, Privileged Identity Management. So PIM lets me kind of do just in time. So PIM is really this JIT. So I can elevate up to an Azure role, an Azure AD when I need it. There are things like identity protection that's helping me detect the risk, helping me detect leaked credentials. It's looking for impossible travel. It's doing those things. Things like access reviews. So it has all of these various capabilities to it. Additionally, well, this is great when I think about my users. So, hey, I have an account, and through a means we'll talk about in a second, I have an account up in Azure AD as well. But if we think about it as a company, well, I probably have other things that I work with. I probably have partners. I have people that I, as a company, collaborate with. Now, they have their own accounts already. Now, that could be kind of an Azure AD account. It could be a kind of Microsoft account. It could be a Gmail account. It could be some kind of direct SAML or federation. It could even be a Facebook. That's kind of a newer feature. Or if it's none of those, I can use a one-time passcode. They'll get emailed a passcode every time they try and access my tenant. And those can be added as kind of known objects through this kind of B2B capability that's part of external identities. Then I can give them access to services. I can give them access to my cloud applications, be it things I've added, be it things I've developed, SharePoint Online. They actually get little stub objects in my Azure AD. I see them. And then we have a different type. And then I have customers. Now a customer, I don't want them in my Azure AD. It would clog it up. And also customers, they want to use my app, but they may want to just create a local application or some kind of social identity. And there's a whole set of those. So the solution here is we have a different instance of Azure AD, but this one is a special type called B2C. And that's really kind of the whole point. This is a B2C, business to consumer. It's a different Azure AD tenant. It's a particular type. It lets me customize every pixel of the user interface. I can even customize the URL now that they see when they authenticate. And it supports a wider range of kind of social identities today. So I can support those things. And let's have a quick look at this. So if I jump back over, firstly, let's look at the B2B side. If I go and look at my users in my tenant, remember these are people I'm collaborating with, B2B are my partners. Here I can see, hey look, I've got some people like Yahoo, well that's using mail, so that's a one-time passcode. I have some people are using a Facebook account. If I keep scrolling down, I have some that are using a Google. And I think if I keep going, I've got some that are actually using a text one-time passcode just via text messages. So I have all of these different types of ways to support my partners that I want to collaborate with, but then I can add them to groups and give them access to applications. And then completely separately, hey, I have an application that's customer facing. So I have an Azure AD B2C instance, and here we can see, well, they support a completely different set of identity providers. Yes, I can create a local account. They don't want to use one of their existing social identities. They want to create a local account in the Azure AD B2C, and I can configure a very custom flow for that. Or they can use this huge range of social identities that they really want to kind of just bring with them to then leverage with this. So we have this massive set of capabilities that they can actually use. So this is kind of how we think about, hey, I have this ability with the Azure AD to support all of these different types of things. So hopefully, by now, something is kind of obvious. Azure AD is definitely not AD in Azure. It's a cloud-based identity provider that speaks cloud protocols, has a massive number of federations to different apps to make it easy for me and my company to integrate with other cloud services. It has fantastic features about controlling the access, securing that MFA passwordless I can do. And it supports integration with my partners, even customers if I need be, which in the AD world was kind of hard to do. I'd normally end up creating my partners an account, which again sucked for everyone. So Azure AD is definitely not AD in Azure. We know it's not that. Again, there's no Kerberos or NTLM or LDAP or any of that stuff. Now the reality is, what you're going to do is you're going to have a hybrid solution. Because it's really not a case of, okay, I have Azure AD, can I get rid of AD? Probably not. I have servers, for example, and those servers, they still speak Kerberos. They still need Active Directory. They're on-prem. I still need my Active Directory. But now as a company, I'm starting to use more cloud applications as part of my just day-to-day business. Well, I don't want to do this federation thing. There's limits to this. Maybe they speak OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. I want to use Azure AD for that. But also, because it's now cloud-based, I want some of those better controls around the security that conditional access gives me, things like identity protection gives me to detect the risk. I want to integrate the MFA for that single identity. So I'm going to use both. Now, what I don't want is two separate credentials. So what actually is happening here is we kind of think about, we use things like Azure AD Connect. There's also a cloud sync version where the engine actually runs now in Azure AD, but it's synchronizing those objects. So there's a separate object in Azure AD, but it's synchronized from my Active Directory. If I was to actually go and look at my Azure AD and I looked at my users, we'll see for most of mine, if I look at directory synced, it's going to say yes, these were synced from Active Directory. Now I still want a seamless experience for my end user, so that's where we have things like Azure AD Connect. And also now we have Azure AD Cloud Sync. And I'm actually using both of those. I'm using Azure AD Cloud Sync for a particular organizational unit just so I can kind of test it. But essentially I'm replicating my objects from AD to Azure AD. Now on its own, that would not be a particularly pleasant option. So then what we do is we add things like seamless sign-on. And what that does is, hey, I'm on a machine that has communications to my domain controllers. When I try and access something in Azure AD, I'm just seamlessly authenticated. Kind of magic behind the scenes. And I kind of lied to you. I said Azure AD does not speak Kerberos. It does in one instance. So the way the seamless sign-on works is Azure AD actually has a computer object in the AD, and it can consume a token that is generated when I try and talk to Azure AD. And we can even see it. So when you set up seamless sign-on, what it actually does behind the scenes is notice this Azure AD computer account. That is representing Azure AD in my AD. So when I try and speak to Azure AD, it kind of pretends it's a computer and says, hey, I need a token. My name is Azure AD SSO ACC. So my client goes to Active Directory and says, hey, I need a token for this. And it actually presents that to Azure AD. And for that one instance, Azure AD actually speaks Kerberos, will take that token and then give me my access token, my refresh token, so I can carry on doing that good stuff. So I can fully integrate. Again, I'm using them together. I think about it's not one or the other. I'm probably going to use both of them. Ideally, when I talk to Azure AD, I want to use cloud authentication. So I'm sending kind of the hash to Azure AD. We really try and move away. It can use federation. It doesn't really buy you anything. Even if you think, I have policies in federation, that's fantastic. They're only used for the first auth. After that, it has a refresh token. All of the checks are done through conditional access. Pass-through authentication is a light agent that will use the on-prem domain controllers to actually talk. So I can do that if I really need to, but the native cloud authentication is kind of the better option. Now, I did say, hey, hybrid. Now, what about user machines? Now, one of the things we do start to see is user machines more and more now maybe not sitting in the corporate network. I have kind of this user machine. Maybe it's at home, maybe it's traveling. So one of the things I can actually do is there's the concept of kind of Azure AD join. So now instead of that joining Active Directory, it's joining Azure AD. I can now authenticate directly with my Azure AD credential, but obviously now I'm not getting group policy. I'm not probably using things like configuration. I'm probably not using Configuration Manager to do patches. So there are other cloud services, things like, for example, Intune. Intune will now actually manage the machine. Intune will do things like policy. Intune will now do things like app deployment. For my patching, hey, I can go and talk to things like Microsoft Update. So I can go and get my patches from there. So we have this whole idea of modern management. Azure AD joined, Intune managed, getting updates from Microsoft Update, etc. Instead of group policy and those types of things. So for most of us, we're going to kind of live in this hybrid world. That's really where everything is going. Now, I kind of said Azure AD is not AD, it's not at all. It's a flat structure. There are things like administrative units. They let me delegate management, certain roles to a certain subset of users and groups, but there's still no hierarchy. It's still this very flat structure. So you're going to use both. I'm going to carry on using AD where I need Kerberos and NTLM and LDAP. I'm going to use Azure AD for my cloud services, maybe more for my desktops. I'm going to start to move those from AD joined to Azure AD joined. While I'm doing my move, I can have my client machines registered to Azure AD. So it's kind of this hybrid join mode, and I can still start to get the benefits of Azure AD. I can start managing them with Intune. But one of the things you're probably going to want to start to do is, hey, you might have a whole bunch of apps currently federated with your on-prem federation services. So many companies will actually start to migrate those federations. I don't want to maintain this federation infrastructure. I want to start migrating those app federations up to the Azure AD native capability. Now, I don't actually have it on my system, but if you did have ADFS, there's actually an Azure AD Connect Health for federation services. I don't see it's kind of disabled when you look. I'm not using federation. But if you were using it, then what I could actually do is if I went to my enterprise applications, and under here, if I'm remembering correct, usage and insights, notice there's this ADFS application activity. I can download and install this, and it will actually go and look at what's talking to ADFS and work out what would be required to actually move that to the native Azure AD set of capabilities. Now, also there are things in Azure AD to help with my Active Directory. For example, I can think about identity protection will go and look for leaked credentials. Okay, that's great. But also there are things around, hey, if I was to go and look, for example, at my security, my authentication methods, there are things like password protection. Stop it using common passwords. I can add custom words that I don't want to be used in my passwords or any kind of modified version using a 0 instead of the O, etc. Well, notice here, I can actually use these same protections for my on-prem Active Directory. I can actually light that up. Again, there's a component that runs on-prem that will help actually give me those same kind of now protections for my on-prem domain controllers. There's things like Microsoft Defender for Identity. Again, my on-prem domain controllers will now have an agent that sends telemetry to this service that used to be called Azure ATP, Advanced Threat Protection, which was a cloud version of Advanced Threat Analytics, was an on-prem version, but it will look for signs of attack on my domain controllers. Pass the hash, golden ticket, DNS kind of scavenging. It will find those things and tell me. So the cloud can actually help with the overall protection of my Active Directory. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Azure AD is not AD and Azure. Most of the time you're going to use them together. However, what if I'm in Azure and I have some service, let's say it's a virtual machine, so it's sitting in a virtual network, and it wants to speak Kerberos. It wants NTLM. It wants LDAP. Well, then I need AD in Azure, and Azure AD is not that. So what member I have is currently sitting on my on-premises network. I have my AD, which is personified by domain controllers. So I really have two kind of options here. Option one, well, I have some network connection between them. And what I could do is, at the virtual network, I can do kind of a custom DNS configuration. So don't use Azure DNS. So I have this custom DNS that basically resolves to the IP address of my domain controllers. What is AD? AD is DNS resolution, and then IP connectivity to the DCs. Or I have a site-to-site VPN, for example, or it could be express route. So I have that link between this IP space of the VNet and this IP space of on-prem. So they have IP connectivity. And now when they go and look up an _LDAP._TCP.saviltech.net, it will resolve. And that will work. I can now use Kerberos and NTLM and LDAP from these services. Or I can build on that and say, actually, I'm going to deploy some DCs actually in Azure. Once again, these are virtual machines. So now my custom DNS would point to those DCs. And once again, I've got Kerberos and NTLM and LDAP in Azure. I'm maintaining those DCs. They could be in the same VNet. They could be in a different VNet. I might have kind of some shared services kind of VNet with the DCs. And then I could use something like peering. So again, they still have IP connectivity. And once again, I would point the custom DNS now at the DCs over there. So I'm bringing my existing AD into my virtual network. So I kind of think about that as option one. So that's extending your existing AD into Azure. When I have AD and Azure AD, AD is always the source of truth. The flow is that way. The objects go from AD to Azure AD. It basically never flows from Azure AD to AD. There's a few things if I change a password or certain machine properties, but it's super limited. Even if I use like a HR link to Azure AD in its provisioning service, it still doesn't create the objects in Azure AD. That HR system talks to the Azure AD provisioning service, which talks to a special component of Azure AD Connect that creates the object in AD, then it replicates up to Azure AD. So it's always that way. Well, there's an option. Now imagine I have that VNet in Azure. And I don't have an AD maybe, or I can't extend it, or I don't want to. And remember we have that Azure AD sitting over here. Again, maybe it's objects replicated, maybe there is an AD and I just can't extend it, so it is replicating, or I can just create in native cloud accounts. But now I've got some workload once again running here that needs Kerberos, that needs NTLM, that needs LDAP. What do I do? So there is one scenario. I kind of have a managed subnet. Azure AD can actually flow in, and it basically creates these managed domain controllers. You cannot access them. You are not an enterprise admin on them. I can do group policy, but this is managed. So this is Azure AD domain services. So it is actually creating domain controllers, and it is actually flowing that way. This is the only time objects can flow that way. It's only to its own managed Azure AD domain services. Then the VNet, for remember that DNS, would point to these. So now the VMs, hey, I can talk Kerberos and NTLM and LDAP to those domain controllers that are replicating the objects from Azure AD to there. And that's kind of option two. Now, one of the things I can actually do is imagine I had VNets in multiple regions. I can actually have up to 4 replica sets. So up to 4 sets of these kind of managed DCs. So I can have 4 in total. I must have peering or some connectivity because I need a mesh network because they're actually going to do multi-master replication between them. But I could have up to 4 replica sets of this managed Azure AD. So that's option 2. If I cannot bring my existing AD, extend it to the cloud, I think that would be my preference. I don't really want a separate AD unless there was some restriction around connectivity or something else. Hey, I can create this managed Azure AD domain services if I need those legacy Kerberos, NTLM, LDAP type connections. It will create that for me in up to 4 regions because I can have 4 replica sets. So that's really it. So I can actually have AD in Azure if I need it by extending my existing or using Azure AD domain services. But hopefully, as we've kind of seen, apart from that, Azure AD is definitely not AD in Azure, but they really work together. I'm going to keep my AD for that Kerberos, NTLM, LDAP. My servers will join it and use it. And then I extend my identity using things like Azure AD Connect into Azure AD, where I can take advantage of its cloud speak, all those built-in federations or custom federations or my apps or publishing apps through App Proxy, all that security with PIM and Azure AD identity protection and access reviews, conditional access, MFA, passwordless, and that great support for my partners and even customer scenarios with B2C. So I hope that made sense. I hope that kind of clarified that Azure AD is not AD in Azure, but hopefully you can see where they really work together and you're going to have this hybrid solution for a long time. Hope that was useful to everyone. Until next time, take care.